Professor Kazix adjusted his fourth tentacle nervously as he reviewed the class roster for the 300th time. In his 20 cycles of teaching extreme survival at the Galactic Academy of Advanced Species Studies, he had never faced such a predicament. There, listed between Zalara of the gaseous clouds and Pakthu of the crystal plains, was a name that made his 3 hearts skip simultaneously. Brooklyn Hayes, Terra Classification Death World. Director Lumix, he warbled into his communication device. There must be some mistake. You've assigned a human to my advanced survival course. Ah. Yes, came the silky reply of the Academy's luminescent director. Our first exchange student from Earth. Quite exciting, wouldn't you say? Exciting? It's practically a death sentence. My course is designed to push the galaxy's toughest species to their limits. The atmospheric chamber alone. Now, Professor Director Lumix interrupted, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with amusement. The exchange committee has approved this placement. Besides, they signed all the necessary waivers. Kazix's scales shifted from their professional purple to a worried mauve. But Director, the last time we had a Category 12 species, they had to redecorate the entire East Wing. Yes, I remember. But humans are only Category 7. Only Category 7. That's because they haven't updated the classification since first contact. Have you seen their planetary defense budget? They spend more on weapons than some species spend on interstellar travel. The professor's protest was cut short by the Academy's bell tone, a harmonious chime designed to be pleasant to all known auditory organs. With a resigned ripple of his scales, Kazix gathered his teaching materials and slithered toward Lecture Hall 7. His other students were already assembled, a fascinating array of the galaxy's most resilient species. Zalara hovered near the ceiling, their gaseous form shimmering with anticipation. Pakthu had crystallized themselves into the traditional learning formation, their facets catching the light. The Hoverian twins had merged into their study configuration, and young T-Plex had assumed their most attentive gelatinous state. Then she walked in. Brooklyn Hayes looked exactly like the briefing materials had shown, yet somehow more terrifying in person. The human moved with the casual confidence of a predator, backpack slung over one shoulder, that ever-present human smile showing far too many teeth. She was wearing what the file had called a hoodie, clearly some kind of environmental protection gear, though it seemed woefully inadequate for any serious survival situation. Hi, Brooklyn's voice rang out with alarming volume. Sorry if I'm late. The gravity in the East Corridor was acting weird, so I had to take the long way around. Kazix felt his scales shift to a mortified orange. The East Corridor's gravity was set to 3G for the heavy worlder's comfort. She had just casually mentioned walking through. Please take a seat, Miss Hayes, he managed to say, his voice only slightly higher than usual. And welcome to Advanced Extreme Survival 101. This course will test your species' limits, push your adaptive capabilities, and... Cool Brooklyn plopped down in a seat, pulling out what appeared to be a water bottle and some kind of nutrition bar. Back on Earth, I did this awesome survival camp in Australia. Have you guys heard of Australia? It's like this continent where everything's trying to kill you. Super fun. The Hoverian twins partially demerged in shock. Pakthu's crystal matrix vibrated with concern. Zalara condensed slightly, forming worried droplets. Professor Kazix looked at his lesson plans, then at the cheerful human munching her snack, then back at his lessons. He had planned to start with the intermediate atmospheric challenges, but perhaps they should begin with something simpler. Yes, definitely simpler. He didn't want another incident like the Category 12 disaster. Though looking at Brooklyn's eager face and remembering the human survival shows he'd researched in preparation, he had a sinking feeling that this semester was going to redefine the meaning of extreme survival one way or another. Professor Kazix had chosen the temperature chamber for their first practical test. It seemed the safest option, a controlled environment with emergency shut-offs and multiple safety protocols. What could possibly go wrong? Today's challenge will test your ability to survive extreme temperature fluctuations, he announced, his scales settling into what he hoped was a confident shade of purple. We'll begin at a modest -70 degrees Celsius and gradually work our way up to positive 120. Brooklyn's hand shot up. Is that all? The professor's scales flickered in confusion. Miss Hayes, perhaps you misunderstood. We're talking about a temperature swing of nearly 200 degrees. Yeah, I got that, Brooklyn nodded, rummaging through her backpack. It's just that back home in Minnesota, we get temperature swings like that between winter and summer. Though I guess the hot end is a bit spicier here. Mind if I bring my water bottle in? Before Kha'Zix could process this casual dismissal of what most species considered lethal conditions, the rest of the class was already preparing their survival gear. The Hoverian twins were applying their fourth layer of thermal shielding. Pak-Thu had restructured their crystal matrix into its most temperature-resistant configuration. Zilara had compressed themselves into a dense, insulated sphere. Remember, Kha'Zix instructed as they entered the chamber, your goal is to maintain consciousness and basic functionality for 30 minutes. Use whatever techniques your species has developed for thermal regulation. Emergency beacons are provided if you need to exit early. Brooklyn was still fiddling with her backpack. Hey, Professor. Quick question, are electric kettles allowed? Electric what? Never mind, I brought a manual one. And some hot chocolate packets. Anyone want some once we're in there? The chamber sealed with a reassuring hiss. Kha'Zix activated the temperature controls from the safety of the observation room, watching his students through the transparent walls. As the temperature plummeted, the various species began their survival strategies. The Hoverian twins vibrated at precisely the frequency their ancestral physics had perfected. Pak-Thu's crystalline form glowed with internal energy regulation. Zilara's gaseous form contracted further, preserving heat at their core. Brooklyn sat cross-legged on the floor, pulled out what looked like a small metal container, and began was she making a fire. Miss Hayes' Kha'Zix's voice crackled through the chamber's communication system. Open flames are not standard survival protocol. Oh, this Brooklyn looked up, already wearing what she called a beanie and mittens, seemingly primitive thermal protection gear. It's just a survival stove. Triple redundancy safety features. Want some tea? The weather's perfect for it. Perfect? The chamber was now at minus 70 degrees. The walls were coated in frost. 2 of the environmental sensors had frozen solid, and the human was humming while heating water. As the temperature began its upward climb, the real chaos began. The Hoverian twins' synchronization slipped by 0.03 degrees, forcing them to recalibrate. Pak-Thu's crystal matrix began emitting a high-pitched resonance as it adapted to the expansion. Zilara was leaving anxious condensation trails in the air. Brooklyn had switched from hot chocolate to something called iced tea. You know. She commented to no one in particular while fanning herself with a paper fan at positive 80 degrees. This reminds me of that time our air conditioning broke during a heat wave. Did you guys know humans invented something called a slip and slide? It's this plastic sheet you put on grass and... Miss Hayes' Kha'Zix interrupted, trying to keep his voice steady as the chamber hit 100 degrees. Please focus on your survival techniques. Oh, right. Sorry, Professor. Though technically talking about cooling off has a psychological cooling effect. There was this study at Hang On. Does anyone need some sunscreen? I always pack extra. When the 30 minutes ended, Kha'Zix had to admit the results were unexpected. The Hoverian twins had maintained impressive stability, though they'd need 2 hours to desynchronize safely. Pak-Thu had developed 3 new facets but was otherwise intact. Zilara had lost about 12% of their mass through evaporation, but would recover after a condensation cycle. And Brooklyn? She had not only survived but had somehow hosted an impromptu temperature-themed tea party, complete with a discussion about Earth weather phenomena that had left her classmates simultaneously terrified and fascinated. That was so fun, she exclaimed as they exited the chamber. Next time I'll bring marshmallows. Did you know you can toast them over a survival stove? Though maybe we should wait for the cold session for that. They get kind of melty in the heat. Kha'Zix watched her chatting with her classmates, who were now cautiously asking about this slip and slide concept. His scales had settled into a confused mix of impressed pink and worried mauve. Director Lumix, he whispered into his communicator, I think we may need to recalibrate our understanding of what constitutes extreme survival conditions. Oh, came the amused reply. And why is that? Because our human student just turned a lethal temperature challenge into a social gathering, with beverages. The director's bioluminescence flickered with what Kha'Zix recognized as suppressed laughter. Well, Professor, perhaps that's the most extreme survival technique of all, making yourself comfortable in any condition. Though perhaps we should review the protocol about open flames before the next session. Kha'Zix looked at his notes for the next challenge, toxic atmosphere survival, and wondered what Brooklyn would make of that. Knowing humans, she'd probably compare it to something called morning rush hour traffic and offer to share her oxygen. Professor Kha'Zix had spent 3 days recalibrating the atmospheric chamber. After the temperature challenge incident, he wasn't taking any chances. He had even added extra filters to prevent any unauthorized beverage preparation. Today we will test your survival capabilities in various toxic atmospheres, he announced, his scales projecting professional confidence despite his internal concern. We will expose you to progressively more challenging atmospheric conditions. Your task is to adapt and maintain basic functions. Brooklyn raised her hand. Quick question. When you say toxic, are we talking about like spring pollen levels of toxic, or more like Black Friday shopping mall perfume counter toxic? Miss Hayes, I assure you this will be far more challenging than your Earth. Did you say perfume counter? Oh yeah. Those are brutal. Brooklyn nodded seriously while pulling something from her pocket. That's why I always carry these. Benadryl, nasal spray, emergency inhaler, you know, the basics. The Hoverian twins rippled with confusion. Zalara condensed slightly in concern. Pakthu's crystal matrix vibrated in what might have been a laugh. These will be specialized compound mixtures designed to test your atmospheric processing capabilities, Kha'Zix continued, trying to regain control of the conversation. We'll start with a mild irritant and progress to. Achoo. The entire class jumped. Well, Zalara briefly expanded. The Hoverian twins desynchronized by 0.1 seconds, and Pakthu developed a small crack. Sorry, Brooklyn sniffled, waving her hand apologetically. Allergies. Turns out some alien atmospheres are basically space pollen. Good thing I came prepared. Kha'Zix watched in fascination as she pulled out what appeared to be a small arsenal of antihistamines, decongestants, and breathing aids. Miss Hayes, the challenge hasn't started yet. Oh, I know. This is just my normal daily setup. You should see what I pack for allergy season. The professor's scales shifted to a concerned lavender. Perhaps you should sit this one out. No way. I've been dealing with environmental hazards since I was born. Did you know Earth plants regularly try to mate with our respiratory systems? And don't even get me started on dust mites. Now those are toxic roommates. Before Kha'Zix could process the implications of hostile reproductive flora, the class had entered the chamber. He began the sequence with a mild corrosive atmosphere. The Hoverian twins immediately activated their protective membrane. Zalara filtered the toxins through their gaseous form with practiced ease. Pakthu's crystal structure began absorbing and neutralizing the compounds. Brooklyn sneezed again. Miss Hayes, are you? I'm good, she gave a thumbs up while adjusting something she called a filter mask. This is nothing compared to my aunt's cat sanctuary. Now that's what I call a hostile environment. As the atmosphere grew more caustic, Kha'Zix observed with increasing bewilderment. Where his other students were employing sophisticated defense mechanisms developed over millions of years of evolution, Brooklyn seemed to be relying on a combination of what she called allergy season survival skills and sheer stubbornness. You know what this reminds me of? Brooklyn's slightly muffled voice came through the chamber's comm system. That time they renovated the chemistry lab during finals week. Now that was toxic. Mrs. Abernathy's perfume, paint fumes, and stress sweat all mixed together. I had to double up on my antihistamines. The Hoverian twins were now watching her with a mixture of horror and admiration. Zalara had drifted closer, possibly to study her techniques. Even Pakthu had oriented their sensory facets in her direction. And then she continued, seemingly unbothered by the increasing toxicity levels. There was that summer I worked at the mall food court, right next to the perfume shop. During prom season, that's when I learned you can actually build up an immunity to. Miss Hayes, Kha'Zix interrupted. The atmosphere is now 60% corrosive compounds. Only 60. Huh, still better than Uncle Joe's holiday cooking. Though I probably shouldn't have mentioned that. Last time I did, he didn't speak to me for a month. By the time the challenge ended, Kha'Zix had to admit that Brooklyn's unorthodox approach had proven surprisingly effective. While her classmates had successfully employed their evolutionary defenses, she had somehow turned the experience into an impromptu seminar on Earth's apparently countless respiratory challenges. Fascinating adaptation strategy, he noted in his assessment log. Subject appears to have developed resistance through constant exposure to hostile environmental factors. Query, are all Earth environments attempting to terminate respiratory functions? That was so interesting, Brooklyn exclaimed as they exited the chamber, already pulling out something she called a neti pot. Next time I'll tell you about convention center air conditioning. Talk about survival horror. Anyone want some throat lozenges? They're honey lemon. Director Lumix's voice crackled through Kha'Zix's communicator. Professor, I've been monitoring the session. Did I hear correctly that Earth plants attempt reproductive contact with their sentients? Apparently so, Director. And that's not even the most disturbing part. According to Miss Hayes, they have dedicated facilities that dispense atmospheric toxins for cosmetic purposes. Remarkable. Perhaps we should revise that Category 7 classification after all. Kha'Zix looked at his student, who was now demonstrating proper nasal spray technique to a fascinated Zalara, and felt his scales shift to a thoughtful blue. Humans hadn't just adapted to their toxic world, they had developed an entire industry around managing its effects. And they called it seasonal allergies. The high-gravity challenge was next on his list. He made a mental note to double-check the emergency protocols. Though knowing Brooklyn, she probably had experience with something equally extreme. What had she called it? Black Friday shopping, he shuddered, his scales rippling with anticipation and dread. Professor Kha'Zix had triple-checked the gravity generator's safety protocols. After the temperature party and the allergy survival seminar, he wasn't sure what to expect, but he was certain it would be educational. Today's challenge involves surviving in high-gravity environments, he announced, his scales a professional shade of purple. We'll begin at 2 standard GS and gradually increase to 5. Remember, this is not a competition, but a test of your adaptive capabilities. Brooklyn was doing stretches. Actually doing stretches. The Hovarian twins watched in horror as she touched her toes. Miss Hayes, what are you doing? Warming up, Professor. Never skip the warm-up. That's what my gym teacher always said. Though honestly, 5GS? That's like the teacup ride at Disney World. You guys ever been to Disney World? No. Oh man, wait till I tell you about roller coasters. Kha'Zix felt his scales shift to a worried mauve. Miss Hayes, this is not an amusement facility. 5 Gs of sustained gravity is enough to. Oh right. Almost forgot my power snacks. Brooklyn pulled out several colorful packages. Anyone want a protein bar? They're great for workout days. I've got peanut butter crunch, chocolate chip, and looks like one mystery flavor from the bottom of my bag. Zalara had drifted to the ceiling, possibly trying to delay the inevitable. Pakthu had already assumed their most compressed crystal configuration. The Hovarian twins were conducting their pre-strain synchronization ritual. Now remember, Kha'Zix continued, trying to stay on track. At the first sign of serious distress, activate your emergency beacon. This challenge is particularly dangerous for species not adapted to high gravitational forces. Cool. Hey, this reminds me of that time our elevator broke and I had to take the stairs to my apartment. 27 flights. Now that was leg day. The chamber activated with a low hum. At 2 GS, the class began their survival strategies. The Hovarian twins merged into a more compact form. Zalara compressed themselves dramatically. Pakthu's crystal matrix realigned to distribute the pressure. Brooklyn was doing lunges. Miss Hayes, Kha'Zix's voice cracked slightly. Please take this seriously. Oh, I am. Proper form is super important under increased gravity. You don't want to pull something. She switched to squats. This is actually great. Usually I have to go to the gym for this kind of workout. 3 GS. The Hovarian twins were visibly straining despite their merged state. Zalara had compressed to half their normal size. Pakthu was emitting a low-frequency hum of effort. Brooklyn started humming Eye of the Tiger. You know what this needs, she called out between sets of jumping jacks that should have been physically impossible at this gravity level. A montage. Every good training sequence needs a montage. Or GS. Pakthu had developed stress fractures along their secondary facets. The Hoverian twins had gone completely silent, focusing all their energy on maintaining cohesion. Zilara was now roughly the size of a tennis ball. Brooklyn was explaining the plot of Rocky to her increasingly distressed classmates. And then he runs up the steps kind of like this. She jogged in place, apparently oblivious to the crushing force that had half the class praying to their respective deities. Though the Philadelphia Museum steps are way more fun. Anyone want to visit Earth? I can show you around. At 5GS, Kha'Zix watched in astonishment as his human student started doing push-ups. Actual push-ups, while giving a detailed critique of various Earth exercise programs. CrossFit is okay, but personally I prefer hang on. She paused mid-push-up. Professor, is artificial gravity supposed to feel different from real gravity? Because this feels more like that time I got on the wrong bus and ended up at the trampoline park. The director's voice crackled through Kha'Zix's communicator. Professor, is she exercising? At 5GS. Yes, director. And apparently comparing it to recreational activities. Fascinating. Though perhaps we should be more concerned about her classmates. Indeed, the rest of the class was showing significant strain. The Hoverian twins had partially desynchronized. Pakthu's crystal matrix was creaking ominously. Zilara had compressed so much they were barely visible. Okay, everyone, Brooklyn called out cheerfully. Group exercise time. Who wants to learn some anti-gravity yoga? It's super helpful for space adaptation syndrome, though I guess we're doing pro-gravity yoga today. Miss Hayes Kha'Zix interrupted. This is a survival exercise, not a fitness class. But Professor, exercise is survival. Besides, look how well it's working for Zilara. They've already got the compression pose down perfect. Zilara, now roughly the size of a marble, vibrated in what might have been agreement or desperate protest. When the challenge finally ended, Kha'Zix had to revise several of his fundamental assumptions about human physiology. His other students would need significant recovery time. The Hoverian twins had to be carefully resynchronized. Pakthu would spend days repairing their crystal matrix. Zilara would need decompression therapy. Brooklyn asked if they could do it again, but with music this time. I must admit, Kha'Zix noted in his log, the human approach to high-gravity survival appears to involve enjoying it. Query, is this a sign of environmental adaptation or concerning psychological development? That was awesome, Brooklyn exclaimed, helping the Hoverian twins stabilize their merger. Next time I'll bring my resistance bands. Oh, and protein smoothies. Anyone allergic to kale? Actually, never mind, I'll bring a variety. Better safe than sorry, right? Director Lumix's amused voice came through the communicator again. Professor, I believe we may need to adjust our understanding of what constitutes physical stress for humans. Director Kha'Zix replied, watching Brooklyn demonstrate cool-down stretches to a still compressed Zilara. I believe we need to adjust our understanding of humans in general. Did you know they deliberately increase gravity's effects on themselves? For recreation. You mean the, what did she call it? The teacup ride. No, Director. Something far more terrifying. She called it a gym membership. Looking at his final challenge plans, Kha'Zix wondered what other human survival habits he was about to discover. Though after today, he was fairly certain Brooklyn would compare it to something called Black Friday shopping. An event that, based on her previous descriptions, seemed to combine all survival challenges into one voluntary recreational activity. His scales shifted to a determined shade of blue. At least the final challenge couldn't possibly be turned into an exercise class. Could it? Professor Kha'Zix faced his class, with all 6 of his tentacles crossed for luck. The final challenge combines everything we've covered so far: temperature extremes, toxic atmosphere, and high gravity. But this time, you'll need to complete specific tasks while surviving these conditions. Brooklyn's hand shot up. Will there be snacks? Miss Hayes, this is a serious survival scenario. Yeah, but like survival requires energy. I brought trail mix and beef jerky. Anyone want some? It's teriyaki flavor. The professor's scales flickered between professional purple and resigned gray. The challenge is to cross the obstacle course, retrieve the survival beacon, and make it back while conditions continuously change. You'll need to. Oh, sweet. It's like summer camp. Brooklyn was already pulling equipment from her seemingly bottomless backpack. Anyone need a spare flashlight? Hand warmers? Duct tape. Duct tape. Yeah, you know, tape that can fix anything? Though technically it's duct tape, but everyone calls it duct tape. Never go anywhere without it. That and zip ties, and a multi-tool. Basic survival gear. The Hoverian twins eyed the growing pile of what Brooklyn called essentials with increasing concern. Zilara had drifted behind Pakthu's crystalline form, possibly for protection. Inside the chamber, holographic barriers created a complex obstacle course. The first section featured narrow ledges over simulated drops, the second had unstable platforms, and the final part required climbing a sheer wall to reach the beacon. Remember, Kha'Zix instructed, this is about survival and completion, not speed. Use your species' natural adaptations too. Brooklyn was tying her hair back and putting on what she called a headlamp. Ready, she grinned at her classmates. This is going to be so fun. Like that time we had a power outage during finals week and had to build a blanket fort in the library. Now that was survival. The chamber activated. Temperature dropped to -40. Gravity increased to 3 gs. The air filled with irritant compounds. The Hoverian twins moved first, their merged form flowing carefully across the ledges. Pakthu followed, their crystal matrix adapting to each new surface. Zilara tried to float over the obstacles but struggled against the gravity. Brooklyn pulled out her duct tape and started wrapping it around her hands and feet. Miss Hayes, what are you? Improvised grip enhancement, she called back cheerfully. Learned this trick rock climbing. Though usually we use actual climbing tape, but duct tape works in a pinch. Hey, anyone need a boost? To Kha'Zix's amazement, she not only crossed the ledges but started helping others. She gave the Hoverian twins a push when they got stuck, showed Pakthu how to distribute their weight more effectively, and somehow rigged a makeshift pulley system for Zilara using her backpack straps and more duct tape. It's all about working smarter, not harder, she explained while jury-rigging what she called a zip line across a particularly wide gap. Like playing Tetris in real life, but with gravity trying to high-five you really enthusiastically. The temperature swung to +80. The toxic compounds increased. The gravity ramped up to 4 gs. Brooklyn switched to shorts and started humming Stayin' Alive. The beat helps you pace your breathing, she told a struggling Pakthu, while helping them secure their fractured edges with yet more duct tape. Also works great for CPR, but hopefully we won't need that today. Anyone want some water? Stay hydrated, that's what my track coach always said. By the time they reached the wall climb, half the class was following Brooklyn's impromptu survival lesson. She had somehow transformed the deadly obstacle course into what she called team-building exercises. Okay, game plan, she announced, studying the wall while munching a protein bar. Pakthu, your crystal structure would make great handholds. Zilara, you can act as a spotter from above. Hoverian twins want to learn how to make a human pyramid. Director Lumix's voice crackled through Kha'Zix's communicator. Professor, is she creating primitive climbing equipment out of adhesive strips and snack breaks? Yes, Director. And somehow teaching cooperative survival strategies through what she calls trust falls. Remarkable. Though perhaps we should be concerned about her influence on the others. Indeed, the rest of the class had fully embraced Brooklyn's methods. The Hoverian twins were practicing synchronized duct tape application. Pakthu had incorporated the adhesive into their crystal matrix. Zilara was attempting to hum Stayin' Alive while condensing. Almost there, Brooklyn called out as she helped the last of her classmates reach the beacon. You guys are doing great. This is way better than that time we had to evacuate the dorm during a blizzard, though the impromptu snowball fight afterward was pretty awesome. When they finally completed the course, Kha'Zix had to admit it was the most successful final challenge he'd ever witnessed. Not only had everyone survived, but they'd apparently learned several new survival techniques involving adhesive tape, snack distribution, and something called the buddy system. "That was epic," Brooklyn exclaimed, already planning their celebration. "Anyone up for s'mores? I've got my survival stove right here. Don't worry, I brought enough marshmallows for everyone." Kha'Zix made his final log entry. "Subject has demonstrated unprecedented survival capabilities through methods that can only be described as primitive genius. Note request clarification on nature of duct tape. Possible human psychic enhancement technology disguised as adhesive." Professor Director Lumix's amused voice came through again. "I believe we may need to revise our entire survival curriculum. Because of the human's superior physical capabilities." "No, because she just taught an entire class of advanced species to survive using processed tree sap, dehydrated food, and surprisingly versatile adhesive strips." Looking at his students gathered around Brooklyn's survival stove, making what she called victory s'mores, Kha'Zix felt his scales settle into a proud turquoise. True, it wasn't the most conventional survival course. And yes, he would need to update the safety protocols to account for impromptu snack breaks and collaborative climbing techniques. But watching a Hoverian twin carefully toast a marshmallow while Pakthu provided crystalline holders and Zalara created the perfect cooling breeze, he realized something important. Sometimes the best survival technique wasn't about having the most advanced adaptations. Sometimes it was about having a backpack full of duct tape and the creativity to use it. Professor Kha'Zix stood before the academy board, his scales cycling through a rainbow of emotional colors as he delivered his end-of-term report. "In conclusion," he said, gesturing to his presentation with 3 tentacles while the other 3 fidgeted nervously, "I believe we need to completely restructure our understanding of survival training." Because of the human director Lumix's bioluminescence, pulsed with barely contained amusement. Because Miss Hayes has demonstrated that our entire approach to extreme survival might be unnecessarily complicated. Kha'Zix pulled up his final slide. "For instance, we've spent decades developing advanced thermal regulation technologies. Meanwhile, humans invented something called a thermos and just carry hot beverages everywhere." The board members shuffled their various appendages uncomfortably. "And the gravity resistance training. They do it for fun. They call it exercise. They have entire buildings dedicated to artificially making things heavier just to lift them." One of the board members, a gelatinous mass of advanced intelligence, rippled in confusion. Surely the toxic atmosphere management was. "They deal with hostile atmospheric conditions so regularly they sell protective compounds in what they call convenience stores." Kha'Zix's scales had settled into a sort of bewildered cyan. "Did you know they have seasonal toxic zones? They call them spring allergies and just go about their daily lives." Meanwhile, in the academy cafeteria, Brooklyn was teaching her classmates how to make paper airplanes. "And if you fold it like this," she demonstrated, "it flies better in high-gravity conditions. Though maybe we should take it to the gym to test that theory. Anyone up for some extreme paper airplane testing?" The Hoverian twins, now proud owners of matching duct tape rolls, were already folding their own aircrafts. Pakthu had incorporated origami principles into their crystal structure. Zalara was experimenting with creating the perfect launch breeze. Back in the boardroom, Kha'Zix was reaching his conclusion. "So you see," he gestured to his final slide, which somehow included pictures of duct tape in various survival situations, "I propose we add a new course, Primitive but Effective Survival Techniques 101. You want us to teach advanced species to use adhesive strips and snack breaks as survival tools?" A crystalline board member vibrated skeptically. "The duct tape alone has shown more practical applications than our last 3 technological breakthroughs combined," Kha'Zix pointed out. "And have you tried these energy bars? They're practically indestructible. Perfect survival food." Director Lumix's bioluminescence brightened with decision. "Proposal accepted, though perhaps we should call it Advanced Adaptive Techniques in honor of our first human graduate. Speaking of which." They all turned to watch through the window as Brooklyn and her classmates tested their paper airplanes in the academy's central atrium, which she had somehow convinced maintenance to set to varying gravity levels for optimal flight conditions. "Should we tell her she's revolutionized our entire survival program?" the gelatinous board member asked. I tried, Kha'Zix admitted, his scales tinting amused pink. She said it was just basic camping skills and suggested we all go on something called a team-building retreat. Apparently it involves something called ghost stories and more of those marshmallow things. As the board watched, Brooklyn successfully demonstrated a paper airplane loop-de-loop in 4 Gs, while explaining something about summer camp to her enthralled classmates. You know, Director Lumix observed thoughtfully, perhaps we should revise that Category 7 classification after all. Why, Kha'Zix asked, watching his star student now teaching the maintenance staff how to optimize the gravity generators using principles from something called roller coaster design. Because any species that turns survival into a recreational activity is either brilliant or terrifying. Possibly both. Brooklyn's voice drifted up from below. Hey, who wants to learn about pillow forts? They're great for temperature regulation, plus we can use them for next week's 0G movie night. Kha'Zix's scales settled into a content purple as he watched his students enthusiastically gathering supplies. Yes, the human had completely upended their traditional survival training. Yes, she had introduced potentially dangerous concepts like recreational survival and competitive relaxation. But watching a Hoverian twin carefully duct tape pillows together, while Pakthu calculated optimal fort structural integrity and Zalara tested atmospheric comfort levels, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the humans were onto something. After all, any species that could turn deadly survival scenarios into social activities had clearly mastered something even more important than survival itself. They'd mastered living.